Among the countless artifacts of power that have shaped the destiny of Tamriel, few carry the weight of tragedy and betrayal as heavily as the Ebony Blade. This cursed weapon, born from the twisted machinations of Mephala herself, has carved a bloody path through the annals of history, leaving behind a trail of broken trust, shattered bonds, and unspeakable horrors. Tonight, we delve deep into the dark legacy of this malevolent artifact, exploring how a simple blade became the instrument of countless betrayals across the ages. The story of the Ebony Blade begins not in the forges of mortal smiths, but in the shadowed realm of Mephala, the Daedric prince of murder, lies, and secrets. Known to the Dunmer as one of the good Daedra, Mephala's true nature reveals itself through her creations, and none exemplify her sphere more perfectly than this cursed sword. Unlike conventional weapons forged from steel or even enchanted ebony, the Ebony Blade exists as a manifestation of betrayal itself, growing stronger not through combat prowess or magical enhancement, but through the systematic destruction of the bonds that hold mortal society together. The physical appearance of the Ebony Blade reflects its sinister purpose. Crafted from what appears to be the finest ebony, the weapon possesses an otherworldly quality that sets it apart from mundane arms. The blade's surface seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an unsettling, void-like appearance that draws the eye while simultaneously repelling it. Along its fuller ancient runes shift and writhe in languages that predate recorded history, their meaning lost to all but the most learned scholars of Daedric lore. The crossguard curves gracefully, resembling the legs of a spider, a subtle nod to Mephala's arachnid nature and her web of deceit that ensnares the unwary. But the true horror of the Ebony Blade lies not in its appearance, but in its insidious enchantment. This weapon does not seek the blood of enemies or the destruction of the righteous. Instead, it hungers for something far more precious and irreplaceable: the trust between friends, the love between family members, and the loyalty that binds companions together. Each time the blade tastes the blood of someone who trusted its wielder, it grows stronger, feeding on the psychic energy released when sacred bonds are severed forever. The mechanics of this terrible curse reveal Mephala's cruel genius. The Ebony Blade cannot be strengthened through conventional means. No amount of training, no masterwork improvements, no powerful enchantments can enhance its capabilities. Only betrayal feeds its hunger. Only the violation of trust can unlock its potential. This creates a horrifying cycle where those who wield the blade find themselves compelled to destroy the very relationships that make life meaningful, trading human connection for raw power in a bargain that benefits no one save the Daedric prince who crafted this instrument of corruption. Historical records suggest that the Ebony Blade has surfaced throughout Tamriel's history during times of political upheaval and social decay. During the late First Era, fragmentary accounts describe a weapon matching its description appearing in the court of a minor Breton lord whose paranoia and suspicion ultimately led to the massacre of his entire household guard. The survivors spoke of how the lord's personality changed after acquiring the blade, how his trust in even his closest advisors gradually eroded until he saw enemies in every shadow and treachery, in every gesture of friendship. In the Second Era, the blade allegedly came into the possession of a renowned Redguard diplomat, whose skill at negotiation had prevented 3 separate wars through careful mediation and the building of trust between opposing factions. Within months of acquiring the weapon, this same diplomat had systematically betrayed every ally he had cultivated, selling state secrets, revealing military positions, and ultimately orchestrating the very conflicts he had once worked to prevent. When confronted by former friends about his transformation, he could only speak of whispers in the night, of dreams filled with spider webs, and of an insatiable hunger that demanded ever greater sacrifices. The Third Era brought perhaps the most well-documented case of the Ebony Blade's corruption. A prominent member of the Blades, sworn to protect the Emperor and uphold the highest ideals of honor and duty, somehow acquired the cursed weapon during a mission to investigate Daedric cult activity in the eastern provinces. Initially, the blade's influence manifested subtly. The agent began questioning orders, expressing doubt about the loyalty of fellow blades, and gradually isolating himself from the Brotherhood that had defined his entire adult life. As the curse deepened its hold, this once honorable protector began feeding information to the very cults he had been sent to investigate. Each betrayal of his sworn duty strengthened the blade, while weakening the bonds that connected him to his former identity. The final tragedy occurred when he murdered 3 of his closest companions during what they believed was a routine patrol, claiming afterward that he had discovered evidence of their treachery against the Empire. Investigation revealed no such evidence, but the Ebony Blade had grown noticeably more powerful, its dark enchantment fed by the destruction of trust and friendship. What makes the Ebony Blade particularly insidious is how it operates on the wielder's psychology. Unlike other cursed items that impose external compulsions or obvious mental domination, Mephala's weapon works by amplifying existing doubts and suspicions, while gradually eroding the emotional connections that normally restrain destructive impulses. The wielder doesn't feel controlled or possessed. Instead, they experience what seems like growing clarity about the true nature of those around them. Friends become potential threats. Family members transform into obstacles to be overcome. Loyal companions reveal themselves as secret enemies, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The blade doesn't force these perceptions. It simply makes them feel increasingly reasonable and justified. This psychological manipulation explains why so few wielders recognize the weapon's influence until it's far too late to resist its corruption. The process typically begins with small betrayals, minor violations of trust that seem justified by circumstances. Perhaps the wielder shares a friend's secret with someone else, rationalizing it as necessary for that friend's own good. Maybe they tell a small lie to a family member, convincing themselves that the truth would only cause unnecessary pain. These initial betrayals feed the blade's hunger, while simultaneously making larger betrayals seem more acceptable. As the weapon grows stronger, its influence becomes more pronounced. The wielder begins to perceive threats where none exist, to interpret innocent actions as evidence of malicious intent. A friend's concern becomes suspicious monitoring. A loved one's attempt to help transforms into manipulation and control. The blade whispers that only through decisive action, through the elimination of these hidden enemies, can true security be achieved. Archaeological evidence from various sites across Tamriel suggests that the Ebony Blade has been responsible for numerous unexplained massacres throughout history. Excavations at ruined settlements often reveal signs of internal violence, where trusted community members turned against their neighbors without apparent cause. Skeletal remains show evidence of wounds inflicted by a single weapon, while personal belongings and family shrines remain undisturbed, indicating that external raiders were not responsible for the destruction. In these cases, investigators typically find evidence of a single individual who had been trusted and respected by the community, but who systematically eliminated everyone who had shown them kindness or loyalty. The pattern remains consistent across different time periods and cultures. A gradual escalation of paranoia and suspicion, followed by explosive violence directed specifically at those who had formed emotional bonds with the perpetrator. The Ebony Blade's connection to Mephala's sphere becomes even more apparent when examining the specific nature of the betrayals it encourages. The weapon doesn't simply drive its wielders to random violence or indiscriminate slaughter. Instead, it focuses their destructive impulses with surgical precision on the relationships that matter most. A parent might turn against their children, but only after months of growing resentment and carefully planned psychological manipulation. A leader might betray their followers, but through elaborate schemes that maximize the emotional impact of the revelation. This calculated approach to destruction reflects Mephala's sophisticated understanding of mortal psychology and social structures. The Daedric Prince of Secrets knows that the most devastating betrayals come not from enemies, but from those we trust most completely. The Ebony Blade serves as the perfect instrument for this philosophy, transforming love into hatred, loyalty into treachery, and trust into the weapon that destroys its own foundation. The curse's persistence across generations speaks to the fundamental nature of the weapon itself. Unlike enchanted items that draw power from external sources or artifacts that contain finite magical energy, the Ebony Blade exists in a state of perpetual hunger that can never be fully satisfied. Each betrayal feeds its power while simultaneously creating the conditions for even greater betrayals in the future. The wielder becomes trapped in an ever-escalating cycle of destruction that ultimately consumes everything they once held dear. Perhaps most tragically, those who fall under the blade's influence often retain enough of their original personality to experience genuine anguish at their actions. They understand on some level that they are destroying the very things that once gave their lives meaning. Yet they find themselves powerless to resist the weapon's corrupting influence. This internal conflict creates a psychological torment that may be even more devastating than the external damage caused by their betrayals. The psychological torment experienced by the Blade's victims manifests in ways that scholars have documented across multiple cultures and time periods. Sleep becomes elusive as wielders report nightmares filled with webs of shadow and whispered accusations from those they have wronged. Waking hours bring no relief, as the constant weight of the weapon seems to press against their consciousness, reminding them of its presence even when sheathed. Many describe a sensation of invisible threads connecting them to their potential victims, threads that tighten with each passing day until the compulsion to cut them becomes overwhelming. The transformation rarely occurs overnight. Instead, it follows a predictable pattern that has been observed in cases spanning centuries. Initially, the wielder experiences what can only be described as enhanced perception. They begin noticing details about their companions that previously escaped attention. Hesitations in speech that might indicate deception, glances between others that could suggest conspiracy, moments of privacy that might conceal treacherous planning. These observations, while often based on mundane reality, become magnified through the lens of growing paranoia until innocent interactions transform into evidence of elaborate plots. During this early phase, the wielder often attempts to test the loyalty of those around them through increasingly elaborate scenarios. They might share false information to see if it spreads, create artificial crises to observe who offers help and who hesitates, or engineer situations where companions must choose between competing loyalties. Each test that confirms their suspicions strengthens their conviction that betrayal is inevitable, while results that contradict their expectations are dismissed as evidence of superior deception rather than genuine loyalty. The Blade's influence extends beyond mere suspicion into active manipulation of relationships. Wielders find themselves unconsciously driving wedges between their companions, spreading doubt and discord through carefully placed comments and strategic revelations of secrets. They become masters of psychological warfare without conscious intent, using their intimate knowledge of friends and family members to exploit weaknesses and create conflicts. This systematic destruction of social bonds serves the dual purpose of isolating the wielder while simultaneously providing justification for the violence that must inevitably follow. As the corruption deepens, physical changes begin to manifest alongside the psychological transformation. Wielders report that food loses its taste, that colours appear muted and grey, that physical pleasure becomes increasingly difficult to experience. The only sensations that remain vivid are those associated with anger, suspicion, and the anticipation of violence. This sensory dulling serves to further isolate the individual from normal human experiences, while making the prospect of betrayal seem increasingly attractive as one of the few remaining sources of intense feeling. The blade's hunger grows more demanding as it feeds, requiring ever greater betrayals to satisfy its appetite. What begins with the violation of minor confidences escalates to the destruction of professional relationships, then family bonds, and finally, the most sacred trusts of all. Each feeding makes the next transgression easier to justify, while simultaneously making it more necessary for the weapon's continued empowerment. The wielder becomes trapped in a spiral of destruction that accelerates with each revolution, consuming larger and more precious relationships with increasing speed. Historical accounts suggest that some individuals have attempted to resist the blade's influence through various means. Religious ceremonies, magical protections, and even physical separation from the weapon have all been tried with varying degrees of temporary success. However, the fundamental nature of the curse makes true resistance nearly impossible. The Ebony Blade doesn't simply impose external compulsions. It rewrites the wielder's understanding of reality itself, making betrayal seem not only justified, but necessary for survival. One particularly tragic case from the late Second Era involves a respected healer who had dedicated her life to mending both physical wounds and emotional trauma within her community. After acquiring the blade during what she believed was a routine purification of a haunted shrine, she began experiencing visions of her patients' hidden resentments and secret hatreds. These visions, likely manifestations of the weapon's corrupting influence, convinced her that those she had helped were plotting revenge for imagined slights and perceived obligations. Over the course of several months, this once-beloved healer systematically poisoned 17 of her former patients, each death carefully orchestrated to appear natural, while targeting individuals who had shown her the greatest gratitude and trust. The blade grew stronger with each betrayal of the healing oath, feeding on the destruction of bonds forged through vulnerability and care. When finally discovered, the healer expressed genuine confusion about her actions, claiming that she had been protecting herself from inevitable betrayal, while simultaneously mourning the loss of relationships that had once defined her entire sense of purpose. The weapon's ability to corrupt even the most virtuous individuals speaks to the sophisticated nature of Mephala's enchantment. The Daedric prince understands that the most devastating betrayals come not from those already inclined toward evil, but from those whose goodness makes their eventual fall from grace all the more shocking and destructive. By targeting healers, protectors, and other pillars of community trust, the Ebony Blade maximizes the psychological damage inflicted on both wielder and victims, while demonstrating the fragility of the moral structures that hold civilization together. The geographical distribution of the blade's appearances reveals patterns that suggest some form of guiding intelligence behind its movements. Rather than surfacing randomly, the weapon tends to appear in locations where social tensions already exist, where relationships are strained by external pressures, or where individuals with access to positions of trust are struggling with personal crises. This targeted manifestation indicates that Mephala, or perhaps the blade itself, possesses the ability to identify optimal conditions for maximum destructive potential. Border regions during times of political uncertainty have proven particularly susceptible to the blade's influence. The natural suspicions that arise between different cultural groups, combined with the stress of potential conflict, create fertile ground for the weapon's psychological manipulations. Military commanders, diplomatic envoys, and local leaders in these areas have historically shown heightened vulnerability to the blade's corruption, perhaps because their positions require them to maintain complex webs of trust and alliance that can be more easily undermined. The blade's impact extends beyond its immediate wielders to affect entire communities and regions. When a trusted leader falls under its influence, the resulting betrayals can shatter social structures that took generations to build. Trade relationships collapse when merchants can no longer trust their partners. Military alliances crumble when commanders suspect their allies of treachery. Religious communities fragment when spiritual leaders turn against their congregations. The weapon's true power lies not in its ability to kill, but in its capacity to destroy the invisible bonds that make civilized society possible. Recovery from the blade's influence, even after the weapon has been removed, proves extraordinarily difficult for both individuals and communities. Those who have experienced betrayal at the hands of trusted figures often struggle to form new relationships, viewing every gesture of friendship with suspicion and every offer of help as a potential trap. The psychological scars left by such profound violations of trust can persist for years or even decades, creating lasting damage that extends far beyond the immediate victims of the blade's corruption. Scholars who have studied the weapon's effects note that communities touched by its influence often develop cultural practices designed to prevent similar betrayals in the future. Elaborate oath-swearing ceremonies, complex systems of mutual surveillance, and rigid hierarchies that limit individual authority all represent attempts to create structures that could theoretically resist the kind of corruption the Ebony Blade represents. However, these very precautions can create the kind of atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that makes future manifestations of the weapon even more likely to succeed. The cyclical nature of the blade's appearances suggests a deeper purpose beyond simple chaos and destruction. Each manifestation seems designed to teach a lesson about the fragility of trust and the ease with which even the strongest bonds can be corrupted. Whether this represents Mephala's attempt to educate mortals about the true nature of relationships, or simply her cruel entertainment at their expense, remains a matter of theological debate among those brave enough to study such dangerous topics. The methods by which the Ebony Blade selects its next wielder reveal a pattern of cruel intelligence that speaks to Mephala's deep understanding of mortal psychology. The weapon rarely appears in the hands of those already inclined toward treachery or violence, for such individuals would provide little satisfaction to its hunger for genuine betrayal. Instead, it seeks out those whose capacity for trust runs deepest, whose bonds with others form the very foundation of their identity and purpose. The selection process appears to involve a complex evaluation of potential candidates based on their emotional vulnerabilities and social connections. Those who have recently experienced loss, faced difficult moral choices, or found themselves questioning long-held beliefs show particular susceptibility to the blade's call. The weapon seems drawn to moments of personal crisis when an individual's normal psychological defenses are weakened, creating opportunities for the corrupting influence to take root before its presence is fully understood. Historical analysis reveals that the blade often manifests during periods when its potential wielder is struggling with feelings of isolation or abandonment, even when surrounded by loving friends and family. A successful merchant who fears his business partners are conspiring against him. A military leader who suspects his subordinates question his judgment. A parent who worries that their children no longer respect their authority. These emotional states create perfect conditions for the weapon's psychological manipulations to flourish. The initial contact between blade and wielder typically occurs through what appears to be chance discovery. Archaeological excavations, inherited collections, mysterious gifts from unknown benefactors, or findings in abandoned ruins all serve as common scenarios for the weapon's introduction into a new victim's life. However, closer examination of these circumstances often reveals subtle patterns of manipulation that suggest the encounters are anything but random. In one documented case from the Third Era, a respected judge in the imperial city discovered the blade while investigating a property dispute involving a deceased collector's estate. The weapon had been carefully placed among a collection of apparently mundane artifacts, its true nature concealed by layers of dust and neglect that made it appear to be simply another decorative sword. Only after weeks of exposure to its influence did the judge begin to understand that his discovery had been orchestrated by forces beyond his comprehension. The judge's transformation followed the typical pattern observed in other cases. Initially, he experienced what seemed like enhanced insight into the motivations of those appearing before his court. Defendants' claims of innocence rang hollow in his ears, while plaintiffs' testimonies revealed layers of deception that had previously escaped his notice. This apparent improvement in his judicial abilities earned praise from colleagues and superiors, reinforcing his belief that the blade was somehow enhancing rather than corrupting his faculties. As weeks turned to months, the judge's newfound perception began extending beyond his professional duties into his personal relationships. He started noticing inconsistencies in his wife's daily routines, questioning the loyalty of longtime friends, and viewing his adult children's visits as calculated attempts to curry favor for future inheritance considerations. Each suspicion seemed validated by evidence that others dismissed as coincidental, but which the blade's influence transformed into proof of elaborate deceptions. The corruption reached its climax during a high-profile case involving accusations of treason against a prominent senator. The judge, now fully under the weapon's sway, used his position to orchestrate a complex scheme that implicated not only the defendant, but also several court officials who had worked loyally under his authority for years. The resulting trials destroyed numerous careers and relationships, while the judge himself emerged apparently vindicated in his suspicions about the treachery surrounding him. The true horror of this case became apparent only after the judge's death, when investigators discovered extensive journals documenting his growing paranoia and the systematic steps he had taken to test and ultimately betray those closest to him. The entries revealed a man aware of his transformation, yet unable to resist the compulsions driving his actions, trapped between his original moral compass and the weapon's insidious influence on his perceptions and judgments. The psychological mechanisms through which the Ebony Blade operates demonstrate Mephala's sophisticated understanding of the cognitive biases and emotional vulnerabilities that govern mortal behavior. The weapon doesn't simply implant false thoughts or memories. Instead, it amplifies existing tendencies towards suspicion while providing seemingly rational justifications for increasingly destructive actions. Confirmation bias becomes a primary tool in the blade's arsenal of corruption. When wielders begin seeking evidence of betrayal among their associates, they inevitably find ambiguous situations that can be interpreted as supporting their suspicions. A friend's delayed response to a message becomes evidence of deliberate avoidance. A family member's questions about the wielder's recent behavior transform into interrogation tactics designed to gather information for hostile purposes. The blade ensures that every interaction contains enough ambiguity to fuel growing paranoia while providing rational explanations for why such vigilance is necessary. The weapon also exploits the fundamental attribution error, encouraging wielders to interpret others' actions in the worst possible light, while excusing their own increasingly problematic behavior as justified responses to external threats. When companions express concern about changes in the wielder's personality, these expressions of care are reframed as attempts at manipulation or control. When friends distance themselves in response to the wielder's growing hostility, their withdrawal is interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than natural self-preservation. Memory itself becomes corrupted under the blade's influence, with past interactions being reinterpreted through the lens of current suspicions. Moments of genuine affection and support are reframed as calculated performances designed to lower the wielder's guard. Shared secrets previously viewed as expressions of trust transform into potential weapons that others might use for blackmail or manipulation. Even childhood memories of family relationships can be corrupted, with innocent events taking on sinister meanings that provide historical justification for present betrayals. The social isolation that results from these psychological changes serves to strengthen the blade's hold over its wielder, while simultaneously making resistance more difficult. As relationships deteriorate due to the wielder's increasing hostility and suspicion, they lose access to the external perspectives and emotional support that might otherwise help them recognize the weapon's influence. Friends and family members who might have provided reality checks or emotional anchoring, either withdraw from the relationship or find themselves targeted as enemies in the wielder's expanding web of paranoia. This isolation creates a feedback loop where the wielder's growing loneliness and alienation are interpreted as evidence that their suspicions were correct all along. The blade whispers that others have abandoned them because their vigilance has exposed hidden treacheries, that their isolation proves the necessity of the betrayals they have committed. Each severed relationship becomes both a victory against deception and a painful loss that drives the wielder deeper into the weapon's psychological embrace. The blade's influence extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of social dynamics, where it demonstrates an uncanny ability to identify and exploit the fault lines that exist within any group of relationships. Every family has old resentments. Every friendship contains moments of disappointment. Every professional association includes competing interests and hidden tensions. The weapon seems to possess an intuitive understanding of these vulnerabilities, guiding its wielder to probe and aggravate existing wounds until they become sources of genuine conflict. In documented cases involving the blade's corruption of community leaders, investigators have noted how the weapon's influence manifested through increasingly sophisticated manipulation of group dynamics. A village elder might begin favoring certain families over others in resource allocation decisions, creating resentment that the blade then exploited to justify more extreme measures. A guildmaster could start questioning the loyalty of long-standing members based on minor infractions or perceived slights, gradually building cases for expulsion or worse punishment. The weapon's ability to corrupt institutional structures demonstrates Mephala's understanding that the most devastating betrayals often occur within established systems of trust and authority. When those responsible for maintaining social order fall under the blade's influence, the resulting damage extends far beyond immediate victims to undermine the very foundations of community cooperation and mutual support. Religious institutions have proven particularly vulnerable to the blade's corrupting influence, perhaps because they rely so heavily on trust between spiritual leaders and their congregations. A priest who begins to suspect their followers of spiritual inadequacy or hidden sins can use their position of authority to devastating effect, transforming sacred spaces into arenas of suspicion and recrimination. The blade feeds on the destruction of faith itself, growing stronger as it transforms sanctuaries of hope into sources of fear and division. Military organizations present another attractive target for the weapon's influence, where the rigid hierarchies and life or death dependencies create perfect conditions for catastrophic betrayal. A commander who falls under the blade's sway can orchestrate the destruction of entire units through strategic incompetence disguised as tactical necessity, feeding the weapon's hunger while apparently serving legitimate military objectives. The temporal aspects of the blade's corruption reveal another layer of Mephala's cruel design. The weapon doesn't simply drive its wielders to immediate violence. Instead, it encourages them to develop long-term strategies for maximizing the emotional impact of their eventual betrayals. Wielders often spend months or even years carefully positioning themselves to inflict maximum psychological damage when they finally act on their corrupted impulses. This extended timeline serves multiple purposes within the weapon's overall design. The delay allows the blade's influence to deepen and spread, ensuring that when violence finally erupts, it will be thorough and devastating rather than impulsive and limited. The extended period of apparent normalcy also provides opportunities for the wielder to gather intelligence about their intended victims, learning their fears, vulnerabilities, and deepest trusts in preparation for their systematic exploitation. Perhaps most cruelly, the extended timeline allows relationships to deepen and strengthen even as they are being prepared for destruction. A wielder might spend additional time cultivating friendships, strengthening family bonds, or building professional partnerships, all while planning their eventual betrayal. The blade feeds on the increased trust and intimacy that develops during this period, ensuring that when the betrayal finally occurs, it will carry maximum emotional weight and cause maximum psychological damage. The weapon's patience in orchestrating these elaborate betrayals reflects Mephala's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between trust and time. Quick betrayals, while painful, can often be dismissed as misunderstandings or temporary lapses in judgment. Betrayals that develop over extended periods, however, call into question the victim's ability to judge character and trust their own perceptions, creating lasting psychological damage that extends far beyond the immediate trauma of the betrayal itself. The economic and political ramifications of the Blade's influence throughout history demonstrate how individual corruption can cascade through entire societies. When merchants fall under the weapon's sway, trade networks collapse as partnerships dissolve in accusations of fraud and deception. When political leaders succumb to its influence, alliances crumble and diplomatic relationships deteriorate, sometimes leading to conflicts that persist long after the corrupted individual has been removed from power. The Blade's impact on cultural development represents one of its most insidious long-term effects. Communities that have experienced its influence often develop elaborate social mechanisms designed to prevent similar betrayals in the future. These protective measures, while understandable, can create atmospheres of suspicion and mistrust that actually make future manifestations of the weapon more likely to succeed. The Blade thus creates cultural changes that persist long after its physical presence has departed, ensuring that its influence continues to shape society across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some civilizations have developed sophisticated methods for detecting and containing the Blade's influence before it can reach its full destructive potential. Ancient Nordic burial sites contain references to ritual objects designed to reveal treachery, while Dwemer ruins show evidence of mechanical devices that apparently monitored the psychological states of community members for signs of corruption. However, even these advanced protective measures seem to have provided only temporary respite from the weapon's influence. The Blade's ability to adapt its approach based on the defenses it encounters suggests a level of intelligence that goes beyond simple magical enchantment. Each successful containment apparently teaches the weapon new methods for avoiding detection, ensuring that future manifestations become increasingly difficult to identify and counter. The cycle of corruption, detection, and adaptation represents an ongoing struggle between mortal ingenuity and Daedric malevolence that has played out across multiple eras and cultures. Each victory against the Blade's influence comes at tremendous cost, while each failure leaves lasting scars on the communities and individuals affected. The weapon thus serves not only as an instrument of immediate destruction, but as a teacher of harsh lessons about the fragility of trust and the constant vigilance required to maintain the bonds that hold civilization together. The understanding of these cyclical patterns has led some scholars to theorize that the Ebony Blade exists not merely as a weapon of destruction, but as an instrument of cosmic balance within the broader tapestry of Tamrielic existence. This perspective, while controversial among traditional theologians, suggests that Mephala's creation serves a purpose beyond simple malevolence, functioning as a necessary force that prevents societies from becoming too comfortable in their assumptions about trust and loyalty. According to this theory, civilizations that develop excessive faith in their social bonds become vulnerable to catastrophic collapse when those bonds are inevitably tested by external pressures. The Blade's appearances, therefore, serve as painful but necessary reminders of the vigilance required to maintain healthy relationships and functional communities. Each manifestation teaches hard lessons about the importance of genuine communication, honest self-reflection, and the recognition that trust must be continuously earned rather than simply assumed. This philosophical framework finds support in the observation that communities which have survived encounters with the Blade often emerge stronger and more resilient than before, having developed sophisticated methods for detecting and addressing internal conflicts before they can escalate to destructive levels. The survivors of these experiences frequently become advocates for transparency and open communication, sharing their hard-won wisdom with others who who have not yet faced such trials. However, critics of this perspective argue that the immense suffering caused by the blade's influence cannot be justified by any theoretical benefits to societal development. The psychological trauma experienced by victims and their communities often persists for generations, creating lasting damage that far outweighs any lessons that might be learned from the experience. The weapon's indiscriminate targeting of innocents alongside those who might theoretically benefit from harsh correction further undermines arguments about its role as a cosmic teacher. The debate over the blade's ultimate purpose reflects deeper questions about the nature of suffering and growth within the Elder Scrolls cosmology. Some theologians argue that all Daedric influences serve necessary functions within the cosmic order, providing challenges and obstacles that force mortals to develop strength and wisdom they would otherwise lack. Others maintain that certain forms of evil exist purely for their own sake, requiring no justification beyond the malevolent will of their creators. The blade's relationship with other artifacts of Mephala reveals additional layers of complexity within the prince's overall scheme for influencing mortal affairs. The Ring of Khajiit, another of Mephala's creations, operates through entirely different mechanisms while serving complementary purposes within her sphere of influence. Where the Ebony Blade destroys existing relationships through betrayal, the ring creates false ones through deception and manipulation, demonstrating the prince's comprehensive understanding of the various ways that trust can be corrupted. Similarly, the Ebony Male's emphasis on stealth and misdirection provides wielders with tools for avoiding the consequences of their actions rather than facing them directly. Together, these artifacts form a trinity of corruption that addresses different aspects of Mephala's domain, offering various paths for those who would embrace deception and betrayal as guiding principles for their lives. The interactions between these different artifacts, when they appear in proximity to one another, have been documented in several historical cases, suggesting that Mephala's influence becomes exponentially more dangerous when multiple vectors of corruption operate simultaneously within the same community. The combination of the blade's psychological manipulation with the ring's capacity for creating false identities and the male's ability to conceal actions creates perfect storms of deception that can destroy entire civilizations from within. One particularly well-documented case from the Second Era describes a trading port where all three artifacts appeared within the span of a single year, brought by different merchants who had acquired them through seemingly unrelated circumstances. The resulting cascade of betrayals, false identities, and hidden crimes transformed a prosperous community into a den of paranoia and violence within months, ultimately leading to the complete abandonment of the settlement as residents fled the atmosphere of pervasive distrust. Archaeological investigation of the site revealed evidence of a systematic breakdown in all forms of social cooperation. Family units dissolved as spouses and children turned against one another based on suspicions that may or may not have had basis in reality. Professional partnerships collapsed as merchants accused each other of theft and fraud, while religious institutions fragmented as clergy members began questioning each other's devotion and integrity. The physical layout of the abandoned settlement tells the story of a community that gradually turned inward upon itself. Barricades erected between neighboring houses suggest growing paranoia about immediate neighbors, while the modification of public spaces to create choke points and defensive positions indicates that even casual social interaction became viewed as potentially dangerous. The central marketplace, once the heart of community life, shows evidence of having been divided into competing territories controlled by different factions who viewed each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens. Personal belongings left behind in hastily abandoned homes reveal the psychological state of the final residents. Hidden caches of weapons and supplies suggest that families were preparing for siege conditions, while coded messages scratched into walls and furniture indicate that even private communication had become a matter of life and death secrecy. Children's toys modified into crude weapons and surveillance devices provide perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence of how completely the artifact's influence had corrupted even the most innocent relationships. The ultimate fate of the settlement's residents remains unknown, as historical records indicate that most fled individually rather than in organized groups, suggesting that even families and close friends could no longer trust each other enough to coordinate their escape plans. Some may have found refuge in other communities, though the psychological damage they carried with them likely made integration difficult. Others may have perished in the wilderness, victims of their inability to cooperate for mutual survival after months of living in an atmosphere of total suspicion. The abandoned settlement became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the trading networks of the Second Era, with merchants and travelers going to great lengths to avoid the cursed location. Local authorities eventually ordered the site to be burned and salted, hoping to prevent any lingering influence from affecting future visitors. However, reports persisted for decades of strange phenomena in the area. Travelers reported hearing whispered conversations in empty buildings, while some claimed to see figures moving through the ruins who vanished when approached directly. Modern scholars who have studied the site note that the three artifacts' combined influence created what they term a trust void, a localized area where the normal social bonds that enable human cooperation became not merely difficult to maintain, but actively dangerous to attempt. The psychological mechanisms that typically govern relationship formation and maintenance became corrupted to such an extent that genuine human connection became impossible, leaving residents trapped in isolated bubbles of paranoia and fear. The implications of this case extend far beyond the immediate tragedy of a single community's destruction. The systematic nature of the breakdown suggests that Mephala's artifacts are designed to work in concert when circumstances permit, creating synergistic effects that exceed the sum of their individual influences. This coordination indicates a level of planning and intelligence behind their distribution that goes far beyond random chance or simple opportunism. The strategic timing of the artifact's appearances also suggests active manipulation of events by forces beyond mortal understanding. The three items arrived during a period of economic prosperity when the community's guard was naturally lowered, when residents were focused on growth and opportunity rather than internal threats. This timing maximized the potential for the artifact's influence to take root before their presence could be detected and countered. The gradual escalation of the corruption followed patterns that have been observed in other cases involving individual artifacts, but compressed into a much shorter time frame due to the combined influence. What might normally take years to develop occurred within months, suggesting that the presence of multiple artifacts accelerates the corruption process exponentially, rather than simply adding their effects together linearly. The documentation of this case has become required reading for scholars studying Daedric influence, serving as a comprehensive example of how seemingly separate manifestations of corruption can combine to create devastating results. The detailed records left by various residents and officials provide unprecedented insight into the psychological and social mechanisms through which such influence operates, offering valuable lessons for those who might encounter similar situations in the future. However, the very completeness of the documentation has raised questions about whether the case represents a natural occurrence or a deliberately orchestrated experiment. The presence of so many detailed observers recording events as they unfolded seems statistically unlikely unless some guiding intelligence was ensuring that the full scope of the artifact's influence would be preserved for posterity. This possibility adds another layer of unease to an already disturbing historical event. The broader patterns revealed by studying this and similar cases have led to the development of theoretical frameworks for understanding how Daedric artifacts interact with mortal societies. These models suggest that such objects operate according to principles that transcend simple magical enchantment, functioning instead as nodes in complex networks of influence that span both time and space. The artifacts appear to possess some form of collective intelligence that allows them to coordinate their activities across vast distances and extended periods. This coordination enables them to maximize their disruptive potential by appearing in combinations and circumstances that create optimal conditions for the destruction of social bonds and the corruption of individual psychology. The intelligence behind this coordination remains a subject of intense debate among scholars. Some argue that it represents direct intervention by Mephala herself, with the prince actively orchestrating the placement and timing of her artifacts' appearances. Others suggest that the items possess emergent intelligence that develops through their interactions with mortal wielders, learning and adapting based on the successes and failures of previous manifestations. A third theory proposes that the coordination represents a natural property of the cosmic forces that govern reality within the Elder Scrolls universe, with artifacts of similar origin naturally drawn together by metaphysical principles that operate beyond conscious control. This perspective suggests that the observed patterns result from fundamental laws of magical interaction rather than deliberate planning by any sentient entity. Regardless of the underlying mechanism, the practical implications remain clear. The appearance of any artifact associated with Mephala should be treated as a potential harbinger of additional manifestations. Communities that discover such items within their borders would be wise to prepare for the possibility that other corrupting influences may soon follow, taking proactive measures to strengthen social bonds and communication channels before they can be systematically undermined. The methods developed for detecting and countering the influence of multiple artifacts simultaneously represent some of the most advanced magical and psychological techniques ever devised by mortal practitioners. These approaches typically involve creating redundant systems of observation and verification that can continue to function even when some participants fall under corrupting influence. Community-wide protocols for monitoring behavioral changes, cross-referencing reports from multiple sources, and maintaining secure channels of communication become essential when facing the possibility of coordinated corruption. The challenges involved in implementing such systems without creating the very atmosphere of suspicion that the artifacts seek to exploit require careful balance and extensive preparation. Religious and magical protections must also be adapted to address multiple vectors of corruption simultaneously. Traditional wards and blessing ceremonies designed to counter individual sources of influence often prove inadequate when faced with the combined effects of several artifacts working in concert. More comprehensive approaches involving entire communities in protective rituals and ongoing vigilance become necessary to maintain any hope of resistance. The psychological toll of living under such intensive protective measures creates its own challenges, as communities must somehow maintain the trust and cooperation necessary for effective defense, while acknowledging the very real possibility that any member might fall under corrupting influence at any time. This delicate balance between caution and connection represents one of the most difficult aspects of defending against Daedric corruption. The historical record suggests that few communities have successfully navigated these challenges without suffering significant losses. Even those that ultimately succeeded in resisting or banishing the artifact's influence typically experienced lasting changes in their social structures and cultural practices. The experience of facing such comprehensive threats to their fundamental bonds leaves marks that persist across generations. These lasting effects often manifest as cultural traditions and practices designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Elaborate systems of mutual accountability, regular ceremonies, reaffirming community bonds, and educational programs teaching the signs of Daedric influence all represent attempts to inoculate societies against future manifestations of such artifacts. However, the very existence of these protective measures can create new vulnerabilities that subsequent manifestations might exploit. Communities that become too focused on preventing betrayal may inadvertently create the conditions of suspicion and fear that make such betrayal more likely to occur. The balance between healthy caution and destructive paranoia remains one of the most challenging aspects of long-term protection against Daedric influence. The cyclical nature of these patterns suggests that the struggle between mortal communities and artifacts like the Ebony Blade represents an ongoing evolutionary process, with each side adapting to counter the other's strategies in an endless dance of corruption and resistance. Understanding this dynamic provides crucial insight into the broader cosmic forces that shape the destiny of Tamriel and its inhabitants. The lessons learned from studying these patterns extend beyond their immediate practical applications to offer profound insights into the nature of trust, community, and the bonds that hold civilization together. The artifacts serve as dark mirrors that reflect the vulnerabilities inherent in all mortal relationships, while simultaneously demonstrating the strength that can emerge from facing such challenges together. The study of communities that have faced the Ebony Blade's influence reveals disturbing patterns in how the weapon selects not just individual wielders, but entire social structures ripe for systematic destruction. Archaeological evidence from across Tamriel suggests that the blade possesses an almost prescient ability to identify societies at their most vulnerable moments, appearing during transitions of power, economic upheavals, or periods when traditional bonds are already under strain from external pressures. The weapon's manifestations often coincide with what historians term trust fatigue within communities. Periods when the constant vigilance required to maintain complex social relationships has begun to wear down the psychological defenses that normally protect against paranoid thinking. During such times, even minor betrayals or disappointments can cascade into larger crises of confidence, creating perfect conditions for the blade's corrupting influence to take root and spread. Regional variations in the blade's impact reflect the diverse cultural approaches to trust and betrayal found throughout Tamriel. In Nordic communities, where bonds of honor and loyalty carry particular weight, the weapon's corruption often manifests through the systematic violation of sacred oaths and battlefield brotherhoods. Warriors who have sworn blood bonds find themselves compelled to orchestrate the deaths of shield brothers, while Jarls turn against the Thanes who have served them faithfully for decades. The psychological mechanisms driving these betrayals exploit the Nordic emphasis on reputation and honor. The blade whispers that maintaining one's position requires eliminating potential challengers, that mercy represents weakness that enemies will exploit, that the loyalty of subordinates masks secret ambitions for usurpation. Each act of treachery is framed as necessary for preserving the very values that make Nordic society strong, creating a twisted logic that transforms virtue into the justification for its own destruction. Imperial territories present different vulnerabilities that the blade exploits with equal effectiveness. The complex bureaucratic structures and political networks that govern the empire create numerous opportunities for betrayal disguised as administrative necessity. A provincial governor might systematically undermine loyal subordinates through false reports of corruption, while a magistrate could orchestrate the legal destruction of longtime allies under the guise of upholding imperial law. The weapon's influence in these contexts often manifests through the corruption of institutional processes rather than direct violence. Legal proceedings become instruments of personal revenge. Tax assessments transform into weapons against political rivals, and administrative appointments serve to reward treachery while punishing loyalty. The blade grows stronger with each violation of the trust that citizens place in their government, feeding on the destruction of faith in the systems that hold civilization together. Dunmer society's complex relationship with concepts of honor and treachery creates unique opportunities for the blade's corruption. The cultural acceptance of assassination as a legitimate tool for resolving conflicts, when twisted by the weapon's influence, becomes a justification for betraying even the most sacred bonds. House loyalties that have persisted for centuries can be destroyed when a trusted retainer begins to view their service as a form of enslavement rather than honor. The blade's corruption of Dunmer wielders often involves the systematic reinterpretation of cultural values and traditions. Ancestor worship becomes a form of weakness that prevents adaptation to changing circumstances. House loyalty transforms into blind obedience that stifles individual achievement. The complex web of obligations and relationships that define Dunmer society provides countless threads for the weapon to pull, unraveling social structures through carefully orchestrated betrayals that appear to serve legitimate cultural purposes. Argonian communities present perhaps the most challenging targets for the Blade's influence due to their unique social structures and connection to the Hist. The collective consciousness fostered by their relationship with the ancient trees creates natural resistance to the isolation and paranoia that the weapon typically exploits. However, when the Blade does manage to establish a foothold within Argonian society, its effects can be particularly devastating due to the interconnected nature of their communities. The corruption of an Argonian wielder often begins with questioning the wisdom of the Hist, interpreting the tree's guidance as manipulation or control rather than benevolent direction. This spiritual rebellion creates a cascade effect as the individual's disconnection from the collective consciousness spreads doubt about traditional values and practices. Community decisions that once emerged through consensus begin to fracture along lines of suspicion and mistrust. The Blade's influence on Argonian society demonstrates its adaptability to different forms of social organization. Where other cultures might be corrupted through the betrayal of individual relationships, Argonian communities face the destruction of their collective identity itself. The weapon transforms their greatest strength, their unity with each other and the Hist, into a source of vulnerability by reframing connection as dependency and cooperation as weakness. Khajiit societies face their own unique vulnerabilities to the Blade's corruption, particularly related to their complex clan structures and merchant networks. The intricate relationships between different Khajiit breeds and their various social roles create numerous opportunities for the weapon to exploit existing tensions and hierarchies. A respected clan mother might begin to view the deference shown by younger Khajiit as mockery rather than respect, while successful merchants could interpret their trading partners' trust as gullibility to be exploited. The nomadic nature of many Khajiit communities adds another layer of complexity to the Blade's influence. Traditional methods of social control and conflict resolution that depend on stable geographic communities become ineffective when dealing with groups that are constantly in motion. The weapon's corruption can spread through trading networks and caravan routes, affecting multiple communities before its influence is recognized and contained. The Blade's impact on Khajiit culture often manifests through the corruption of their traditional storytelling and oral history traditions. Trusted talekeepers might begin altering stories to cast doubt on the loyalty of rival clans, or to justify aggressive actions against former allies. The gradual distortion of cultural memory serves the weapon's purposes by undermining the shared narratives that bind Khajiit communities together across vast distances and diverse environments. Bosma society's unique relationship with the Green Pact creates distinctive vulnerabilities that the Blade exploits through environmental and spiritual corruption. The complex taboos surrounding the consumption of plant matter and the emphasis on harmony with the forest provide numerous opportunities for the weapon to create conflict through seemingly minor violations that escalate into major breaches of trust. A Bosma wielder might begin interpreting the actions of clan members as violations of the Green Pact, seeing treachery in innocent mistakes and deliberate sabotage in accidental transgressions. The weapon's influence transforms the very laws that govern Bosma society into weapons against social cohesion. Traditional punishments for breaking the pact become opportunities for eliminating personal enemies under the guise of religious duty. The interconnected nature of Bosma communities with their forest environment means that the Blade's corruption can extend beyond human relationships to affect their connection with the natural world itself. Trees that once provided guidance and protection begin to seem threatening and alien. Animal companions that have served faithfully for years are viewed with suspicion and fear. The weapon corrupts not just social bonds, but the fundamental relationship between the Bosmer and their homeland. Redguard culture's emphasis on honor and martial prowess creates specific patterns of corruption when exposed to the blade's influence. The weapon exploits the competitive nature of Redguard society by transforming healthy rivalry into murderous jealousy. Sword singers who have trained together for years begin to view each other as obstacles to advancement rather than brothers in arms. The blade's corruption of Redguard wielders often manifests through the systematic violation of the codes of honor that govern their martial traditions. Sacred duels become opportunities for assassination rather than tests of skill. Training sessions transform into attempts to cripple rivals through seemingly accidental injuries. The weapon feeds on the destruction of the trust that makes intensive martial training possible without constant fear of treachery. The Redguard tradition of ancestor veneration provides another vector for the blade's corruption. Wielders begin to interpret the actions of their ancestors in increasingly negative ways, viewing historical heroes as flawed individuals whose legacies need correction through modern action. This reinterpretation of cultural heroes serves to justify present betrayals as necessary improvements upon past mistakes. Orcish society's complex relationship with concepts of strength and leadership creates unique opportunities for the blade's corrupting influence. The traditional system of determining leadership through combat and challenge becomes twisted when a wielder begins orchestrating the deaths of potential rivals through treachery rather than honorable contest. The weapon transforms the very mechanisms that maintain social order into tools of destruction. The blade's influence on Orcish communities often begins with questioning the legitimacy of current leadership, not through direct challenge but through subtle undermining of confidence and trust. A trusted advisor might plant doubts about a chief's decisions, while a respected warrior could spread rumors about the cowardice of former heroes. These actions serve to weaken social bonds while appearing to serve the traditional Orcish values of strength and honesty. The stronghold structure of Orcish society creates concentrated targets for the blade's corruption. When the weapon influences a key figure within a stronghold, the resulting betrayals can destroy entire communities in a matter of days. The close quarters and interdependent relationships that make strongholds effective for defense become vulnerabilities when trust breaks down completely. The temporal patterns of the blade's influence reveal sophisticated understanding of how societies develop and maintain their protective mechanisms over time. The weapon rarely appears during periods of obvious crisis when communities are already alert to threats and working together to address challenges. Instead, it manifests during times of apparent prosperity and stability when vigilance has naturally relaxed and people are focused on growth rather than survival. This timing ensures that the blade's initial influence can establish itself before its presence is recognized as a threat. By the time communities realize they are under attack, the weapon has often already corrupted key relationships and decision-making processes, making organized resistance extremely difficult to coordinate. The blade's patience in waiting for optimal conditions demonstrates the sophisticated intelligence behind its manifestations. The weapon's influence also appears to accelerate during periods of generational transition, when younger community members are assuming leadership roles from their elders. These natural points of tension and adjustment provide perfect opportunities for the blade to exploit differences in perspective and approach. What might normally be resolved through discussion and compromise becomes fuel for paranoia and betrayal. The intergenerational conflicts fostered by the blade's influence often prove particularly devastating because they corrupt the natural processes through which communities transmit wisdom and values across time. When elders begin to view the younger generation as threats to be eliminated, rather than inheritors to be guided. The continuity that enables cultural survival becomes impossible to maintain. The Blade's corruption of educational and mentoring relationships represents some of its most insidious effects. Teachers begin to view their students as competitors rather than beneficiaries of their knowledge. Masters craftsmen sabotage apprentices rather than training them. Parents turn against children they once cherished, viewing them as ungrateful burdens rather than sources of joy and pride. These betrayals of fundamental nurturing relationships strike at the heart of what makes civilized society possible. When the bonds between those who give and those who receive care become corrupted, the basic trust necessary for human development and learning disappears. Communities affected by such corruption often struggle to recover for generations, as the survivors carry deep psychological wounds that make forming new relationships extremely difficult. The weapon's impact on religious and spiritual communities demonstrates its ability to corrupt even the most sacred bonds. Priests who have dedicated their lives to serving others begin to view their congregations as sources of exploitation rather than spiritual responsibility. The Blade transforms religious authority from a tool of guidance and comfort into an instrument of manipulation and control. The corruption of religious institutions proves particularly effective because it attacks the fundamental beliefs and values that provide meaning and structure to people's lives. When spiritual leaders fall under the Blade's influence, their betrayals don't just destroy individual relationships, but undermine entire worldviews and belief systems. The resulting spiritual crisis can persist long after the immediate threat has been eliminated. The Blade's influence on healing professions reveals another dimension of its sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability. Physicians, counselors, and others in caring roles possess intimate knowledge of their patients' weaknesses and fears. When corrupted by the weapon, they can use this knowledge to inflict psychological damage that extends far beyond physical harm. The betrayal of healing relationships proves particularly traumatic because it violates the fundamental human need to trust those who care for us during our most vulnerable moments. Patients who have been betrayed by corrupted healers often struggle to seek medical attention in the future, viewing all offers of help with suspicion and fear. This secondary damage can prove more devastating than the original betrayal. The weapon's impact on artistic and cultural institutions demonstrates its ability to corrupt the creative impulses that enrich human life. Musicians, writers, and other artists who fall under the Blade's influence often use their talents to spread discord and mistrust rather than beauty and inspiration. Cultural celebrations become opportunities for social manipulation rather than community bonding. The corruption of artistic expression represents an attack on the shared symbols and narratives that help communities understand their identity and purpose. When cultural leaders begin using their influence to promote suspicion and division rather than unity and understanding, the very foundations of social cohesion begin to erode. The Blade feeds on this cultural destruction while ensuring that its effects persist across generations. The weapon's influence on trade and economic relationships reveals its understanding of how material interdependence creates opportunities for betrayal. Merchants who have built their reputations on honest dealing begin to view their trading partners as marks to be exploited rather than colleagues to be respected. The Blade transforms economic cooperation into a zero-sum game where success requires the destruction of others. The corruption of trade relationships often has cascading effects throughout entire regions as supply chains break down and commercial trust disappears. Communities that have grown dependent on trade goods find themselves isolated and vulnerable when merchant networks collapse due to widespread betrayal and fraud. The economic damage can persist long after the Blade's influence has been removed. The weapon's impact on scholarly and educational institutions demonstrates its ability to corrupt the pursuit of knowledge itself. Researchers who have dedicated their lives to understanding truth begin to view their colleagues as competitors to be eliminated rather than collaborators in the search for wisdom. The blade transforms academic discourse from cooperative inquiry into intellectual warfare. The corruption of scholarly communities represents an attack on humanity's collective effort to understand and improve their world. When the institutions responsible for preserving and advancing knowledge become consumed by paranoia and betrayal, entire fields of study can be lost or distorted. The blade's influence on education ensures that its effects extend into future generations through the corruption of learning itself. The patterns revealed through studying the blade's historical manifestations suggest that its influence operates according to principles that transcend simple magical enchantment. The weapon appears to function as part of a larger system of cosmic forces that test and shape mortal societies according to incomprehensible designs. Understanding these patterns provides crucial insight into the ongoing struggle between order and chaos that defines existence within the Elder Scrolls universe. The blade's role in this cosmic drama extends beyond its immediate destructive effects to encompass broader questions about the nature of trust, community, and the bonds that make civilization possible. Each manifestation of the weapon teaches harsh lessons about human vulnerability while simultaneously demonstrating the resilience that emerges from facing such challenges together. The survivors of these encounters often become advocates for transparency, communication, and the recognition that maintaining healthy relationships requires constant effort and vigilance. The ongoing study of the Ebony Blade and its effects continues to yield new insights into the fundamental forces that shape mortal society. Each documented case adds to our understanding of how corruption spreads through communities and what measures might prove effective in detecting and countering such influence. This accumulated knowledge represents humanity's best hope for protecting future generations from the weapon's terrible legacy. Yet even as scholars work to understand and counter the blade's influence, its very existence serves as a constant reminder of the fragility of the bonds that hold civilization together. The weapon's patient hunger for betrayal continues to pose a threat that transcends any single community or era, representing a cosmic force that will likely persist as long as mortals continue to form relationships based on trust and mutual dependence. The true horror of the Ebony Blade lies not in its capacity for violence, but in its ability to transform love into hatred, loyalty into treachery, and trust into the very weapon that destroys its own foundation. As long as mortals continue to form bonds with one another, the blade will remain a potent symbol of the price that must sometimes be paid for the gift of human connection. Its dark legacy serves as both warning and challenge, reminding us that the relationships we cherish most deeply are also those most vulnerable to corruption and betrayal.